Hello, thank you for tuning in to another edition of Tech Talk Tuesday. I'm Jason.
And I'm Zach.
And let's get busy with the news.
Xbox will soon begin testing a pilot program which allows Xbox One owners to upgrade to an Xbox Series console. This will only be available right now for select Xbox insiders. After analyzing insider feedback, they will determine if they are going to broaden the scope of the program to actual owners of the device.
That's pretty nice. If you have an Xbox, you can maybe upgrade to an Xbox One or Series S or X, but not have to worry about waiting in line at Micro Center for a week. Sony has released that the PlayStation 5 could remain hard to get into 2022. As we mentioned last week, the AMD processor is changing, but it's still going to be hard to get through 2021 and into 2022. This information came from unnamed sources at a recent briefing.
Monday, cybersecurity researchers disclosed that there is a new Android Trojan aimed at stealing bank information. It is targeting customers of banks in various European countries. The Trojan steals users' credentials and SMS messages to facilitate fraudulent activities. They named it T-Bot. T-Bot allows for a live stream of the infected device's screen, which is pretty crazy. T-Bot is disguised as a media application. And once installed, the fake application asks for permissions to view unusual sections of the device. Observing your actions, retrieving window content, and performing gestures is some of those permissions that you have to permit it to read when you install it. Therefore, it is super important to look at what an app does before you install it in any case. If it is asking to do things that an app shouldn't need to do, it's a huge red flag.
Yeah, it sounds like it's using like a keylogger, but for a phone instead of just like a computer.
And the screen capture software, which is a big deal.
Elon Musk's Starlink program has struck a deal with Google. Google agreed to supply computing and networking resources to SpaceX. SpaceX will need to install stations on site at Google data centers for communication between the on-ground networks and the Starlink satellites.
The FBI has named Darkside as the hacker group responsible for the attack on the Colonial Pipeline. It is said that they are of Eastern European origin. The Colonial Pipeline paid around $5 million in ransom to Darkside for the infection that occurred to get their systems back. They paid using Bitcoin, which was approximately 75 Bitcoins. And Darkside supposedly did send a decryptor to the pipeline, but it was so slow that the pipeline just continued to use their offsite backups to restore their systems in place of that decryptor.
Yeah.
We absolutely never recommend paying a ransom, even if your files that got encrypted are crazy important.
You have a very small chance that they'll actually give you access. Let's say you have 1,000 files, and they might, if you pay the money, they might give you access to 2% of that, and then say give me more, and then additional 2, and they just keep on doing that. They also have threatened to release sensitive information to the world, but in this instance, the FBI started watching that wallet as soon as it came out, and as far as we're aware, the Darkside hasn't been able to access that money or move it anywhere else since it happened, but still something to be keep an eye out for. Cryptocurrencies across the board have drastically lost their value in the past 2 weeks. Bitcoin hit a recent low of 30K. Ethereum dropped below 2K from a high of almost 4K.
Yeah, higher than that.
Dogecoin went down to 30 cents at a high of like 68, 69 cents. They're starting to bounce back a little bit. Bitcoin is currently at 37K. Ethereum's at 2.6K, and Dogecoin is around 34 cents. A lot of that is due to the recent tweets and decision from Tesla and Elon Musk to not accept Bitcoin payments for their Tesla vehicles, which is kind of sort of counterintuitive anyway. Your one is designed to help the environment, the other one is designed to make money that causes an immense amount of energy usage. So it makes sense for them not to do that, but probably should have done that from the beginning.
Microsoft has announced that it will completely end support for Internet Explorer. This will affect certain versions of Windows 10, and while Windows 8.1 should still be able to use Internet Explorer, they are expecting for this to go into effect June 15th of 2022. So you do still have about a year to prepare for that if it goes through this time.
Yeah, if you're using Internet Explorer anyway, except for if you have to, chances are there's probably better Explorers out there. They've tried to kill Explorer off for a few years now, but maybe this attempt will actually go through.
I mean, their new Chromium Microsoft Edge is pretty decent.
Yeah, Edge isn't too bad.
My opinion.
Yeah, running off the Chrome software. Okay, so today for our tech tip of the day is brought to you by Zach.
We want to encourage anybody who is needing Microsoft Office but doesn't really want to pay for it, or if you're on an older version of Microsoft Office and you're required to pay for it because you're so old you can't just upgrade anymore, to try LibreOffice or OpenOffice, which is an open source software, which is actually linked to our discussion today on open and closed sourced software. LibreOffice and OpenOffice look very similar to Microsoft's paid Office suite, and a lot of the functionality is the same across the board.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to be talking about today in our product demonstration, is the differences between open source and closed source software and how that could benefit you.
Closed source software is what most people are probably familiar with, like Apple and Microsoft, is software that holds the source code or code of the software safe and encrypted, meaning end users cannot copy, delete, or modify parts of the code, not without certain consequences, and these consequences could be avoided warranty or legal repercussions.
Yeah, so you guys are familiar with like the Apple operating system, like for Catalina, or the Microsoft Windows. Those are closed source programs that don't allow you to really edit them too much, whereas open source is
software, basically the exact opposite of closed sourced software. Users can copy, delete, and modify the source code of the software. People can take from source code on one program and develop their own in their own work. Closed and open source software doesn't necessarily indicate monetary value. Just because something is open sourced doesn't mean it's going to be free, although it very often is. And closed source software can be free, but it is typically paid for.
Yeah, sometimes I go back and forth between, I remember for a long time I used Windows Media Server, Windows Media, which is like a media player to play movies and stuff like that. That eventually became open source, like they stopped providing code to it, so they just finally opened it up for open sourceness. So it was closed sourced and moved to open source, and then that has actually eventually came to be what is currently known as Kodi. So they use an old Windows Media code that was originally closed source. They've opened it back up and actually let it be utilized for open source programs.
So working into probably the major differences between these two types of software, closed source software has support, FAQs, a way to contact support, manuals, and instructions on usage. Open source software does not have any dedicated line of support. However, it still does have a user-based support. You usually must find forums and discussion boards that other users discuss issues on. Some open source software has very useful support forums. Arch Linux has a massive support forum known as ArchWiki. This is extremely popular on the Linux side of stuff. These support forums and wikis are ran by a compilation of users of the software.
So just because it's open source doesn't mean you have to get support or pay for support. There's support out there, it just might be a little bit harder to find than dialing a 1-800 number. But the good thing about the closed source is that they should have supportive lines, like call Microsoft, call Apple. There's a process involved with some support. But with open source, you might have to do a little more digging, it's a little more buggy, and do what you need to do to find the program that works for you.
Next on our list of differences is flexibility. Closed source software has limited modularity because we, for the most part, only have access to what the developers want us to see and use. A counter of this is jailbreaking iPhones used to be popular, but that voided the warranty because the source code was modified to do things that it was not intended by the manufacturer. Open source software excels in this field because of the ability to freely edit however the end user wants. This is why there are so many different distributions of Linux, because of the modularity, but we do not see different distros of Windows or Apple outside of what the manufacturer actually releases to us. This is primarily why Linux is less mainstream than Windows. In Apple, there is not a single distribution that is used by most people, so developers cannot specifically develop for Linux like they can for Windows and Apple. Ubuntu is a very popular distribution of Linux. It has become more compatible with other software because a lot of people use it. But outside of that, it's pretty tough to kind of target software towards Linux distributions.
Yeah, usually the closed source softwares are pretty good looking, if you will. They look pretty presentable. They have pretty good user interfaces. The open source software has been a little bit less pretty, if you will, but it's gotten a lot better over time. Like Linux has gotten a pretty good user interface now over time.
So final on the list of differences between open source and closed source software is the security surrounding the software. Open source software is a double-edged blade in terms of security. The development and fixes are done by the community that actually uses the software instead of the developers of the software. Not that developers don't contribute to this, but the community is allowed to contribute to it, unlike closed source software. Because of this, it is open to anyone, including hackers and people with malicious intent. As we spoke of a couple weeks ago, the University of Minnesota was actually banned from developing on the Linux kernel because they were intentionally feeding bugs into the source code of patches that were getting released. So on the other side, patches and releases can be checked in substantial detail by users in the community for odd things in patches and releases, as you saw with this, and they did something about.
Yeah, I wonder if they're actually trying to just test on how good the Linux platforms were on finding those bugs. I still haven't read as far like what their reason was to do.
They were doing a social experiment on the people using open source software.
So specifically because of this stuff.
Yeah.
But it caught it and it actually went through, so that's good. But there's definitely a risk associated with open source software or closed source software in that regard.
Yeah. Closed source.
Not that there isn't in regards to closed source software, because we deal with that every day. That's why so many days, every day there's a different definition of like security suites that come out and definitions that are there to protect you. So they deal with it as well.
Closed source software also has its pros and cons. It is often seen as more secure because only those allowed to develop on the software get access to doing so. There's not a community flooding it with whatever they want to. On the flip side, it does not get to be reviewed by the users of its community for oddities. Anything could be in the code, and hidden functions could be present that users are not aware of because it cannot be analyzed.
Yeah, but the chances are a little bit less because there's a lot less hands involved on a closed source project. Let's say there's maybe 100,000 people that are working on Windows, for instance, but there's probably 2 million people that are working on Linux, and they can just have their hands in the pot. So I can see how that'd be. It's better, but it's not foolproof. Well, that ends our show for today. Thank you guys for watching and tuning in. Please tune in next week.
We will catch you next week.
Thank you.